great pleasure that we are launching Fiona Wilson's book, Citizenship and Political Violence in Peru, an Andean town, 1870s to the 1970s. Fiona is Professor Emeritus at the Institute of Society and Globalization at Roskilde University in Denmark, and a visiting fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, and she has worked on Peru for many, many years, and I'm sure many of you know this is a combination of many years of work on Tarma. So it's really our privilege to have her here and to be able to launch the book. So to discuss the book, we have Professor James Dunkerley. James is a professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London, and he is the author of many, many books on Bolivia, Central America, and also the Americas as a whole, the hemisphere. And we also have Dr Patricia Oliart, who is a lecturer in Latin American Studies at the University of Newcastle, has also many publications, many of which deal with education in Peru, which is a theme that links up very well with Fiona's own expertise. So I'll hand over to James.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for the invitation to be part of the launch of this splendid book. And it really is a very good book. I know it's rather overpriced, but let's get the baggage out of the way to start with. The second thing I have to say is that clearly the running order of the speakers this evening is a rising order of knowledge and of fluency and of association with this wonderful book. If I might then, without setting a particularly loose tone to this evening, take us back to a moment I remember very vividly, which was in September, some 12 years ago, in a bar in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I was sat on the bar between two Peruvians, Martin Tanaka and Carlos Ivan de Renegori. We were there because we couldn't leave, and we couldn't leave because there were no flights out of Chapel Hill, and there were no flights out of Chapel Hill because of 9/11. And we were watching the first day's replay, which was pretty well uncensored, I have to say. And so violence in the town, particularly the city of New York, was very much on our mind. It was difficult to form words. Anybody who was in the States at that time will, I'm sure, recognise that experience. And Martin went across to Carlos Ivan, who's cited several times in Fiona's book, and said, "Well, what do you make of it?" And I remember his response immediately, and I've jotted it down. "They'll find out who's behind it, but it'll really take time to find out what is behind who's behind it." Yeah? And that, I think, is really a very quite remarkable statement at the time. It's a pretty good description of what Fiona's book has done, with respect not to violence by Al-Qaeda, but the violence of Sendero Luminoso. I should say that there is a spoiler warning on page 188, which says nothing is necessary, didn't have to happen. So this is a book, first of all, I want to identify as dealing with origins rather than causes of violence. And I think that's really important. It's not, throughout its text and its organisation, which is fresh and always mobile, it is not a work of teleology, it's not a work of determinism. And I think that that's a really great gift in context of the material I know in and around this subject. It's particularly resonant on the 50th anniversary of Edward Thompson's book, The Making of the English Working Class, which is also in this text in areas of its sensibility to class as a relation rather than a thing. Yeah? Class as a dynamic relation rather than a thing. And of course, it's out of that text that so many historians over the subsequent 50 years grasp this concept of moral economy. Yeah? Not pure economy, not pure culture or politics, and not a sequence between those things either, but, if you like, an immediate chemical reaction in society. And in this case, what the early chapters for the historical period of the late 19th and early 20th century do is tease out the, if you like, the synapses between those various elements. They look at the dynamism between indigenous rights and citizenship, and it's that relationship which lies at the very heart of Fiona's study. Now, there's, as I said, a mobility of form. Although there are chapters, and although those chapters are chronological, within the chapters there's great variety. There are snapshots. What Fiona's book does wonderfully well is to use, if I may, the approach of a cinematographer. There are framing shots at some distance, and there are close-ups where the drama really takes place. And she's very good as an experienced scholar and somebody who knows that this is important to bring you to those close-ups rather than thrust you into a morass of testimonial where you can't see the wood from the trees. The wood and the trees are here, although it's not always a very wooded landscape in which we're perambulating. So, where is this town? Well, I think Fiona and Patricia will tell us more about that in terms of pure geography. But I want to stress from the outside that it's a provincial study. It's a study of a provincial society. It's a study of rural-urban relations, of regionality, and at times, as you might expect, of downright parochialism. Yeah? And so what this book has, which I think is throughout a dynamic of richness, is a Janus-like quality. It looks up figuratively to the capital, the centralising nation-state level of Lima. Lima was always a problem for these people, very rarely a source of emancipation. And when I say these people, I'm meaning the principal source of information, which is the urban elite. Yeah? But it also looks down, figuratively again, from the urban mestizo elite to the rural indigenous mass around it, figuratively and, if I may, literally. Yeah, in a way, as I say, that has that Edward Thompson idea of relationships changing and not having an essential and immutable quality. And in the early stages of this relationship, and I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on the earlier period, what it is that is most fascinating is the way she teases out the fact that that elite, a new Republican elite, in a period where great sort of abstract theories about the Peruvian economy would say it was moving to free trade and the introduction of capitalist relations, is struggling immensely hard to maintain colonial relations. Yeah? Because those relations of reciprocity are the bonding local relations, however much they wanted trade and the moneyed economy and what have you. And they needed to be sure that they had, if you like, a political economy, control over the assignment of the use of common land. That was the thing, that was the link with the colony. Yeah? And that this would circulate, and it would be known to circulate, and therefore it would legitimize their authority within the local community. That, for a while at least, as I read you, outweighed any pressures from British merchants, from Gibbs Brothers, Guano, all these other things that are out there and in the books. It was that kept things on a steady keel. One of the things, so when I was reading, I had to do some background reading, I was really slow on this. This is a book from, quite a while ago. I think there's a little bit of nostalgia coursing around this room this evening, 1987, in which Fiona has an essay on transport. You know? I remember, I don't know if you attended a conference on political economy in Cambridge in '76. I know because I talked with Liz, but, yeah, when all the greats were there, you know, Cardoso and O'Donnell, that one, you see, there you go. Individuals count, guys. Sometimes abstractions don't. You can't remember that conference in Cambridge in 1976, but you remember who was there. Yeah. And all they talked about were things, big Marxist boxes, and one of them was communications. And I kind of liked it because it wasn't then, departments didn't have, there weren't departments of communications in British universities or any other ones. Yeah, and actually, there's a lot of communications in the subtext of the book that we're launching today. There's a lot more in here. And there's a fascinating sense in which some of the points I've just started there relate to railways and truckers. Yeah, and the importance of that relationship and what it means, which we tend to gloss out with abstractions, because to be absolutely honest, very few people in university have either driven a railway locomotive, or if they've driven a car, they haven't been a teamster and a trucker and what that means. Yeah? But that's a sort of indication of Fiona's ability and fascination with gritty detail and how it matters for the bigger issues. As I say, it goes through time, so we first of all don't have any truckers, and we start to get railways and then truckers come in. But throughout it, I think, and I'm going to leave Patricia to talk about it because she really knows, there's a strain about education, yeah? Which of course in the, is often now at the forefront of our concerns, but 30 years ago was by no means so, and it was a second order. Also, another strain that goes through all of these chapters and is most important, not perhaps very, how shall I put it, sexy, but most important, is hygiene and public health. Yeah? Really, really important. And it's far higher. I was shocked at how high it was up the elite's concerns. Yeah? And I was equally shocked at how they'd given it a prescriptive, normative feature, which was, again, really doesn't appear in the general histories of the time, but appears in the modern historiography of Mexico and Peru much more now, and of course, Paolo knows about that as well. What does all this add up to? Well, I think in terms of the sort of social science understandings, it adds up to a monograph about capacity and capability of control. Yeah? And the fact that that is a contested relationship. It's in the interests of most of the actors, most of the time in this book, to have control, but to be part of the equation that is control, and to be a democratic part of it. That's the citizenship side of it. Yeah? And so what Fiona's text does is bring that down to the level of individuals, bringing that down to the level of families and of elites as well as of abstractions. Now, at the level of individuals, I've been assured that this individual is the one who occupies an entire chapter. This is right, isn't it?
This is right.
I don't know how you pronounce, I know you say call him a Donford, but how do you pronounce his surname?
Greenwich.
All right.
Spanish.
Greenwich, the pharmacist, the anarchist, the troublemaker, the man who didn't fit in, and eventually the man who was persecuted to take his own life. This is a book that doesn't miss out on the dramas and really get a feeling of that, yeah, of how those things work. So, Fiona,
when did he live?
He lived.
100 years.
He lived from
1867 to 1908. He committed suicide in 1908, and on the front of the book is his gravestone.
So I don't want to steal the thunder on that one. I just wanted you to see the picture because I have to tell you, I negotiated the initial contract with Palgrave when I was a menial, because the contract is, all about categories of dominant multinational capital, and there's one map in here which we'd like to have more of, and there's no real nice pictures like this which we would definitely like to have. So the author gets the picture. Yeah. Okay. I think that's probably all, but there is now a school named after him, is there not? Or a school with the...
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So there's an enduring feature that comes down from that, even if, as I said at the beginning of my few remarks, there's no teleology. In fact, there's not a lot about Sendero on the page here at all. There's a lot about SUTEP, the teachers' union, and there's a lot about the calculations of individuals. So what they're going to do in an increasingly desperate situation on the ground. And I think that's wonderfully well. But I think you're right to take Carlos Ivan de Gregori's term. tierra de nadie, yeah, no man's land, or res nullius in the Roman tradition, which by Roman law would normally revert to the state, and of course in this case eventually did. So, although I started off with some off-putting remarks about retailing, the context between discoveries is very valuable indeed.
I would like to say a few things about why I consider the book important beyond the knowledge that is here. And I would like to talk first about the book as a really good example of how can we say this, exemplary north-south relationships in scholarship, because of the role that Peruvian production, Peruvian historiography has here. And this is really unusual, I have to say, sometimes when you read a work by scholars from the north, sometimes sources produced by local academics are not considered as peers sometimes, or there is a lot of discussion. But the role that Peruvian scholarship has here is the one of peers, and this is something that I would like to say that is great to find. Also, another thing that I find really a good contribution in the book is the way in which several areas of knowledge come together because of Fiona's own trajectory. So you have a big revision of Peruvian historiography together with very important debates on development studies as well, and good dialogue with anthropologists and racial issues. So the book really brings together different disciplines, different areas of debate in a very organic way. Also, the fact that this is a personal project, the main drive behind this has not been the need to publish anything or to achieve anything, but Fiona's own agendas, Fiona's own interest and passion to a topic. So it has been a long process with lots of conversations and reflections, and it all comes together here. You get a great story, and I think it's because of all the freedom and passion that is put into it, and therefore it's a great read just for that very reason, because you read it with pleasure. You acquire knowledge, but also you get to know the academic behind the writing. Then about the contents of the book, I think that it really brings to the fore a new agenda for the study of local politics in Peru. Because we know very little about what was going on in the provinces during the process of state construction in Peru. And this access to the letters to the city council, that were the letters that were citizens writing to the city council, and the responses to those letters, allows us a really good look into the concerns of these Peruvians who wanted to be part of the nation, and who are not, how can I say this, they are many times imagined. When you read other books of Peruvian history, there is a gap and a very kind of blurred description of who these local actors were. And sometimes you tend to reproduce in your mind the images of the central state and the terratenientes, the landowners, and the indigenous peoples. But here you see people that you don't normally see. You see the Italian immigrants, the German immigrants in a provincial town trying to be part of the Peruvian nation from a liberal view. So in a way we are getting really fresh actors that we haven't had a chance to see before. And in that sense, I think there is a great contribution here. And also to realize how difficult it was for them to get their aspirations through. So this liberal white provincial people couldn't get what they wanted from Lima because of how parochial the Lima regime was, the control of the country from Lima was, and how very little interest there was really in developing the nation. So it brings very concrete empirical evidence of these things that many times are talked about, the lack of leadership in Peru, and how we are not a nation because nobody ever wanted it from the elites. And this brings a lot of empirical evidence of this lack of dialogue, this lack of interest in the early 20th century, and the ways in which local politicians, people interested in making politics and doing politics, faced this hard relationship with the state in Lima. And the next great contribution is how whomever had dissenting opinion was considered a dissident and rebel. And this brings to the fore the violent nature of politics in Peru. And this, I think, is one of the main contributions of the book, because it allows us to see that this future that was described in the 60s, I think, by this American sociologist, who said that in Peru there was no room for negotiation because workers and peasants had learned that the only way of being heard was to go in for a strike, because no dialogue was possible. But we see here that this also happened with the elites, and whenever the elites had an agenda of their own in the provincial towns, they were just not listened to, or they were considered rebellious or dissidents, and therefore being cancelled, the possibility of having a dialogue being cancelled, and then they were sent to the margins with no possibility for a political exchange or a dialogue, or a dialogue. And another issue that I wanted to point at is the relationship that Fiona establishes with her sources. And this is also something to, if you read the book, that you're going to see, and also because of personal experience of talking to Fiona and her deep and long reflections about how to interpret this relationship between source and interpretation, I think is really good to see in the book, because her readings and her attentiveness to what her interviewees had to say were taken with great patience and long time of thinking to bring together an interpretation that is very thoughtful, that is really brings you, the actors, to the front, and you can actually listen to them as she had listened to them. These are the main things I wanted to say. Perhaps, well, and reading the book, I had also a reflection about how this kind of forced politicized view of racial relations in Peru, in the end, has ended up blurring the strength and the particularity of a white elite that was not necessarily made of landowners or of oligarchs, but is a middle class, a white middle class elite from the provinces who saw the country in a different way. And this is an actor that comes through this book, and I also think that this is a very important and valuable contribution, the identification of this particular political actor. That Tarma, Fiona tells us the story of Tarma, but I know of the same kind of people in other places like Cusco or Puno or Ayacucho, where these, but I don't think that nobody has done the work yet, but there are local heroes who come from this same tradition. There is, in Puno, for example, a little plaza with a poem that is called Orgullo Aymara. and the author is an Italian immigrant, Landenauer. So lots of European immigrants who came to Peru in by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, fell absolutely in love with the culture. And there are examples like this, Vinrich, the one of Vinrich, that need to be studied. Therefore, the agenda that this book brings is something to be followed.
Well, thank you both so much for reading and reflecting and making me also see something else in the book. You know, this is what is so wonderful, to get people's commentary, because it's not something that's actually stuck. It is something that will continue to go on. Now, I thought I'd just say something about how this book was written, because some people here know that I have been engaged in Tarma for a long time, and why on earth did this happen? What was wrong with me that meant that I continued, not all the time in the same place, but at two periods of my life, which I then try to bring together in this book. I might also say that it's coming through also in both the comments. It took a very long time for me to find my voice in this material. On the one hand, a lot of kind of testimonial stuff, which I did not want to get submerged in. But on the other, I wanted to do justice to what people were thinking and saying and writing, mostly, because much of it, of course, is before I could interview people. And so I could listen intently. But where is the person who's trying to bring this together? And this took me a long time, I think, to fit into what were the big arguments that I wanted to make within this book. And the big arguments have been, I think, and picked up, particularly about the origins of political violence. But that only came latterly. You know, some books seem to follow an orderly path. From conception to problematic, through fieldwork, analysis, and then there's drafts and chapters and publication. This is not that kind of book. Patty used the word organic. Yes, organic in a way, but the image that comes to my mind was of really an infant brought struggling and screaming onto the page. This was not easy. This is a sort of book with a lot of tensions in it. I hope that the readers don't see all the tensions that the author suffered, but it was not an orderly progress. Up to the last minute, before the sort of final submission to the patient production team at Chennai, which does the Palgrave Macmillan book series, chapters were changing shape. Chunks were being rewritten at the last minute. Whole sections left out because I was over the word length. The whole text was in movement before I finally had to say, off it goes. But I want to say something about really why I was facing a number of dilemmas with this, and so it wasn't just my incapacity to get this book written in time. I think that trajectory, I was facing things that I think quite a number of other people, when they let an idea emerge over a longer period of time. Because the material that the early chapters are built upon, I've found, read, noted back in the mid-1970s. I discovered an archive in a storeroom behind the town's fire engine. I found 60 ledgers, you know, big leather-bound ledgers, 40 ledgers of copies of the letters written by the mayors of Tarma between the late 1860s and about 1908, the year Vinrich committed suicide. Over that period, 40 ledgers of letters. There were in addition 20 ledgers of the minutes of the meetings of the Provincial Council of Tarma. Now, this bulk of written material in itself is extremely interesting. This was a very, very lettered, epistological, how do you say it? I mean, epistolary, writing letters. They wrote many of the letters were written to the prefect, whose office was always next door. Did they go off and have a coffee? No, they didn't. They wrote letters to each other. Great for the historian, but extremely difficult. I, at the beginning, didn't know how to read these letters. I mean, reading an archive is no easy matter. It's taken me a lifetime to do that. I collect as a diligent doctoral student in the mid-70s. I did write down verbatim chunks of this material about how municipal government functioned in the late 19th century, relations with the indigenous surrounds, relations with districts, and relations with Lima. How was it that they saw their erosion of the autonomy of municipal government? How was it depicted by the actors concerned and affronted them? And this was happening early 20th century. So this is this opening. Comes back again, this archive in the 1940s, when there was a popular government, the Bustamante government. It didn't last for very long, but there was an upsurge of local political identity, and with it an archive. So this kind of the written and the political trying to find a political voice, the two were going together amongst literate elites in small towns and medium-sized towns. And that really, I'm sure this is not the only archive. Precisely where it is at the moment, the original, I'm not quite sure. It could be that my handwritten copy is what is left, because it could have been thrown out by mayors. I kept track of it until the mid-1990s. Anyway. Okay, I had this. I wrote my doctorate. I wrote my doctorate using very, very little of that archive. And I wrote it under, at the time, a Marxist paradigm of political economy about modes of production and the penetration of capitalism in the periphery. Fine, I mean, it was a fascinating subject. It did not draw on these kinds of material, because it was outside somehow what I saw as relevant back then. Right, then I moved to Denmark, and I had to get used to a very different intellectual tradition of Scandinavia. So my archive went with me, and it was in basements and different houses around Copenhagen, and I didn't go into it. I tried to write the history, failed miserably. There is no the history. And I was rescued, fortunately, by a brilliant generation of students and young scholars in Denmark, who sort of forced me to sort of really take on board what representation was all about and what post-structuralism was all about, and really to give me some intellectual tools with which I actually could look again at what people were telling me. There was a key book which was published, I think, I can't remember the date, States of Imagination, it was called, an ethnographic exploration of the post-colonial state, edited by Thomas Bloch Hansen and Finn Steppenchak, which came out of a programme I coordinated, and which this was marked, in a sense, the transition from this way of thinking that I had when I first met these documents to what I then tried to do. Of course, all this kind of transition takes a lot of time. But then, in the 80s, as we know, events happened in a very surprising way in Peru, the political violence. And as Carlos Ivan talks in this book, How Difficult to Be God, there's a whole section on how surprised government, intellectuals, observers were that this had happened. And I think the implication of an explosion, well, a mounting realization of what that strategic use of violence was meaning, meant that one had to put new questions about historical trajectories. What can we learn? I happen to be in possession in my different cellars around Copenhagen of material which I had never properly analysed, but which I was sure could give some kind of enlightenment. I might say that it was also with a lot of local newspapers, and a lot of local pamphlets, and this was sort of going up to the 1940s, a bit into the 50s. That forced me to say I had to get back into trying to find out origins, not causes, but to almost to let the picture be much more complicated, muddied than these superficial, simplistic ways of saying why was it a result of the agrarian reform was meant it was political violence. Fully. I mean, this was something about a ways of being, of thinking, that predated so much of that. I just want to record an encounter. I actually write it in the introduction here, which really, I went back to Peru to work on school teachers after the conflict. I went back in 1994. It was still pretty tense. Police posts and military posts were still functioning. That was why I went back to Tarma. One of security. People knew me from before the conflict, and it was easier to go and ask questions. And I started talking to school teachers who then, at that particular moment, early 90s, wanted to explore with a sympathetic outsider what had made them take decisions they'd taken. And in some cases, very much about their own involvement with Patria Roja and with Sendero. They were Maoist and they had to look again. That, again, brought me in touch with quite a lot of political school teachers in Tarma. And that's the background for an encounter I had in 1997. I had been allowed to join a group of experienced teachers who were attending the teacher training college, because in the long vacation they could go and take courses and get their formal qualifications. And this was a benefit of the Velasco government, and it hadn't yet been taken away. I was allowed to go and take part in the classes that teachers themselves were running. And by way of reciprocity, I could give seminars to the teachers about Tarma's history. So there was one day I gave a seminar about the first radical wave, late 19th century, that was led by Adolfo Wiemerich. Chemist, son of a German immigrant, had been a disciple of González Prada when he was a young biology student in Lima. He'd come back with the explicit agenda of criticising and waging politics against the landed elite. This was explicit. He was headed the socialist, the Socialist Party. It was the Unión Nacional, which was a radical party. He headed it. He led local elections to try and get a socialist majority in power in the provincial council. Now, this whole idea that you could possibly get elected radicals into local government is not something that is widely known in Peru. There was an exchange of newspapers with Tarma and various other cities. Obviously, the radicals were becoming quite a threat seen from Lima eyes. Anyway, I gave this paper about Wiemerich. The class was full. I was flanked by two strong Maoists, leaders of religion. And there was, everybody in the classroom knew about Wiemerich. They knew about him not just as the first folklorista, which he's now famous for, but as a radical leader. Afterwards, a pamphlet appeared in kiosks all over Tarma, saying that a subversive by the surname of Wilson was under investigation by the police. And they named, as senderistas, the two men who had sat either side of me. I went to the police station and ascertained, I had my Catholic University pass and all sorts of things that they might have been investigating me, but possibly not. That kind of made me realise that Wiemerich was somehow or other still a force that could it was accidental that the classroom informer had told the police about it. But still, there was a penny drop that there were hidden histories here. The stories about Weenrich had been handed down generation to generation in certain families in the town. And that he was remembered for fighting against oppression, and also that his death was seen as being virtually as being murder by the prefect. It wasn't seen as suicide. 1908 was the year taken to mark the end of municipal autonomy and the beginning of a clientelistic, subservient, kowtowing to presidents in Lima, and an aloof state that didn't give a damn about the provinces. There was a date when provincialism was invented, and the elites couldn't have much room for manoeuvre apart from that. So that was, I say, that really made me say, right, with great kind of fear and trembling, I went back into material which I had collected at different phases to try and make sense, but with the end of the story, which was a feeling of grievance which younger generations of secondary school children, provincial university youngsters felt they had no option but to go into political violence. That there was something that had been going on, this repression, continued repression of forms of opposition that didn't give political voice. This is not an excuse, it's a way of thinking through these connections over time. Now, the result was a set of chapters that didn't talk at all well to each other. I mean, that was my first. And then Paolo came into the picture, who read a first draft of the whole manuscript, and who indeed convinced me that one of the red threads was indeed this man. And in every chapter is something about Weenrich now. I mean, he's prominent, but it's much more about how he exemplified a voice, an alternative voice, not a popular voice at all, but one that was within a different and more democratic socialist tradition that had been sort of then papered over. I tried very hard to get the chapters to work together. Then I was rescued by Tristan Platt, who had been this wonderful reviewer, and who really grilled me on the logic, which was missing, and the prose, which was still at times purple. Indeed, he read out to me, like you do to a doctoral student, he read out to me, do you really mean this? And I sort of went away and thought, no, I think I have to do yet more revisions. Sadly, the publisher would not publish the photographs I have. I have a collection of 1920s photographs which I couldn't get copyright for, and which is why it is just bereft of photographs. But the Spanish edition will have all these, because now there's no copyright with the Spanish edition. Then I had to change the title, because the earlier title, which was suggested to me by a very dear friend who now died, Donald Cruz O'Brien, who said, when he knew the book, because I talked about it so much to him, he said, well, the title, it's got to be On the Lookout for the Path. And that would have been such a brilliant title, which still, there's a chapter heading of that. So that is, there are reasons why some books take a very long time to produce, and don't give up the struggle. She says, sitting here and thanking everybody for coming, and thanking the presenters.
Well, it's a huge pleasure to be able to be here at all, and also to congratulate Fiona on a fantastic book. Really, it's a marvellous piece of work, and I'm extremely proud to have it in our series. As some of you know, this is a series, the Palgrave Studies in the Americas, which I edit, and which produces marvellous books like this. And it is rare indeed, I think, to find such a kind of condensed and painstaking analysis of the antecedents of Sendero, as Fiona does. So we have a long-term view, but also approximate causes for the eruption of that particularly violent struggle. And Fiona's book gives us this kind of wonderful, painful picture of a whole history of exclusion and marginalisation, which allows us to understand the force of the eruption of that particular struggle in that period. So I recommend the book strongly. I hope you'll buy it. I hope you'll read it. It will be put in the library. It has been put in the library. And also be my particular pleasure to also thank the panel for launching it with us. But it's over to you, I think, to talk to Fiona and everybody later, but also to join us in a celebratory drink for Fiona's book. So thank you very, very much.